The gunshot victim at her door wasn't supposed to change everything. He was supposed to die. But when Alara Quinn dragged that bleeding stranger across her frozen threshold, she didn't just save a man, she inherited an empire, and a war she never asked for. This is a story about impossible choices, deadly secrets, and one widow who refused to disappear into the Wyoming wind. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The wind came first, always. It rolled across the Wyoming plains like the breath of something ancient and angry, stripping the November sky down to bone-white clouds and bruised horizons. Alara Quinn stood at the edge of her property, one hand pressed against the swell of her belly, the other gripping a fence post so weathered it threatened to splinter under her fingers. The land stretched endlessly before her, beautiful and brutal, a canvas painted in gold-brown grasses and stubborn sage, framed by mountains that looked close enough to touch, but never were. She'd been standing there for nearly an hour, watching the horizon as if it might offer answers. It never did. 25 years old, 6 months pregnant, widowed for 8. The numbers carved themselves into her thoughts like names on a headstone. Thomas had been dead since March, kicked in the chest by a spooked mare and gone before sunset. She'd buried him herself with the help of 2 ranch hands who'd disappeared within the week, moving on to steadier work with steadier pay. Now it was just her, 73 acres of failing grassland, a cabin that leaked in 3 places, and a debt that grew faster than the child inside her. $240, she whispered to the wind, by December 1st. The bank had been clear. Mr. Horace Grayson, with his steel spectacles and voice like grinding stone, had stood in this very spot 3 weeks ago and delivered the terms without mercy. Pay the outstanding mortgage and accumulated interest, or the land would be sold at auction. The cabin, the livestock, the small vegetable garden she'd coaxed from the unforgiving soil, everything Thomas had worked for, everything she'd hoped to give their child, would belong to someone else. Alara turned back toward the cabin, her boots crunching through frost-stiffened grass. The structure hunched against the landscape like something weary. Log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that smoked even when the fire inside burned clean, windows so small the interior stayed dim even at noon. It wasn't much, but it was hers. For now. Inside, she moved through the rituals of survival with practiced efficiency. She fed the stove with the last of the good firewood, saving the green branches for when desperation demanded it. She checked the preserves in the root cellar, 17 jars of pickled vegetables, 9 of wild berry jam, a sack of potatoes already sprouting eyes. She counted the coins in the tobacco tin hidden behind the loose hearthstone, $11.30. She'd counted them yesterday. The number hadn't magically improved. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. She'd sold everything she could: Thomas's rifle, his good saddle, the silver watch his father had given him. She'd taken in mending from the women in town until her fingers bled, charged less than anyone else, and still the work had dried up. Pregnant widows made people uncomfortable. They were reminders of how quickly fortune could turn, how thin the margin between respectability and ruin. She'd tried to sell the cattle, but the 3 remaining head were so thin their ribs showed like xylophone keys. No one wanted them. She'd offered to work the Morrison ranch for wages, but Mrs. Morrison had taken one look at her swollen belly and shaken her head. "Too much risk," she'd said, not unkindly. "You understand." Alara understood perfectly. She understood that the world had no place for a woman in her position, too vulnerable to be useful, too proud to beg, too isolated to simply disappear. Evening came early this time of year. By 4 o'clock, the light had already started to fail, turning the landscape into something ancient and unfamiliar. Alara lit the oil lamp, carefully, rationing the fuel, and settled into the rocking chair Thomas had built the winter before he died. Her hands found the knitting needles automatically, working on a blanket she'd started 3 months ago. The yarn was coarse and undyed, traded for a jar of jam and half a dozen eggs, but she worked it with the fierce concentration of someone building a fortress 1 stitch at a time. The baby kicked, a flutter, then a solid thump against her ribs that made her gasp and smile simultaneously. "I know," she murmured, letting one hand rest against the spot. "I know you're there." She talked to the baby sometimes, when the silence grew too heavy, told it about Thomas, how he'd laughed at his own jokes, how he'd been terrible at cards but played anyway, how he'd once spent an entire afternoon trying to teach her to whistle and failed spectacularly. She talked about the future too, spinning stories about the child's life like they were prophecies instead of desperate wishes. "You'll go to school," she'd say. "You'll learn to read better than I can. You'll have choices." The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Elara set down her knitting and moved to the window, peering through the wavy glass into the gathering darkness. Weather was coming. She could feel it in her bones, that peculiar ache that preceded storms in this country. She'd need to bring in more wood, check that the chickens were secure in their coop, make sure the well cover was weighted down. She was reaching for her coat when she heard it, a sound, wrong and out of place. Not the wind, not an animal, something else. Elara froze, every sense suddenly sharp. Her hand moved automatically to the space beside the door where Thomas's rifle had stood before she'd sold it. Empty. She'd kept the hunting knife, at least. She pulled it from its sheath on her belt, the blade catching lamplight. There. Again. A low sound, almost like a groan, coming from the east side of the cabin near the lean-to where she kept the few tools she hadn't sold. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, bar the door, wait for morning. But morning might be too late for whoever was out there. And if it was an injured animal, it could attract wolves, or worse. She grabbed the lamp and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. The sky had gone the color of old bruises, heavy with unshed snow. She moved slowly, the knife held low and ready, the lamp raised high enough to cast a weak circle of light around her. "Who's there?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Show yourself." No answer, just the wind, and underneath it, that sound again, definitely human, definitely in pain. She rounded the corner of the cabin and stopped. A man lay crumpled against the woodpile, his body twisted at an angle that suggested he'd collapsed rather than laid down. His clothes were dark, whether from color or blood, she couldn't tell, and his hat had fallen off, revealing dark hair matted with sweat despite the cold. One hand pressed against his side, the other flung out toward her as if reaching for help. Elara's breath came short and fast. Every fiber of her being wanted to back away, to run inside and pretend she'd seen nothing. Strangers meant danger. Everyone knew that, especially strangers who showed up bleeding and half dead at your door. But even as the thoughts formed, she was moving closer, lowering herself awkwardly to her knees beside him, the baby's weight making the movement clumsy. She set the lamp down and reached for his wrist, feeling for a pulse. Weak, thready. But there. His eyes opened, just slits, but enough for her to see they were pale, gray, or blue. She couldn't tell in the lamplight. His lips moved. No sound came out, but she could read the shape of the word. Help. "Damn it," Elara whispered. "Damn it, damn it, damn it." She knew what the smart choice was. The safe choice. Leave him. He was probably dying anyway. Getting involved with a stranger's trouble in this territory was a recipe for disaster. He could be wanted. He could be dangerous. He could be followed. But she also knew what the cold would do to him overnight, what the wolves would do if they caught the scent of blood. She knew because she'd seen it before, years ago, when she was still a child. A trapper, caught in his own snare, left out too long. They'd found him in the spring thaw, what was left of him, and she'd had nightmares for months. This is stupid, she told herself. Then she grabbed the man's arm and pulled. He was heavier than she'd expected, dead weight made worse by her own awkwardness. She managed to drag him a few feet before her back screamed in protest, and the baby kicked sharply, as if in objection. She stopped, panting, and reassessed. "Can you help at all?" she asked, knowing it was probably futile. "Can you stand if I support you?" To her surprise, his eyes opened wider. A sound came from his throat. Not words, but something that might have been a scent. He shifted, trying to get his legs under him, and Elara seized the moment. She braced herself and pulled, and together they managed to get him upright, though upright was generous. He sagged against her immediately, his weight threatening to take them both down. "Move," she commanded, wrapping one arm around his waist and feeling the sticky warmth of blood soaking through his shirt. "One step, then another. That's all. Just don't you dare die on me before we get inside, you understand?" I didn't risk my back and my baby hauling you this far just to have you quit now." Maybe it was her tone, sharp enough to cut through the fog of shock, or maybe some stubborn core of will inside him. Either way, he moved. One stumbling step, then another, leaning on her so heavily she thought her knees might buckle. The distance from the woodpile to the cabin door couldn't have been more than 20 feet, but it felt like miles. By the time they reached the threshold, Alara's vision had started to spot with the effort, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She kicked the door shut behind them and steered him toward the bed, her bed, the only bed, letting him collapse onto it with a groan that sounded like it came from somewhere deep and broken inside him. Blood immediately began soaking into the quilt her mother had made, the one piece of her old life she'd managed to keep. "Of course," Alara muttered, staring at the spreading stain. "Of course." She turned to the stove, coaxing the fire higher, then pumped water into the basin and set it to heat. Her hands moved through familiar motions, gathering clean rags, finding the bottle of carbolic acid she'd been saving, pulling out the sewing kit with its precious few inches of catgut thread. She'd stitched up animals before. Chickens attacked by hawks, the old tomcat after a fight. She'd even sewn Thomas's hand once, after he'd cut it open on barbed wire. But this was different. This was a man, a stranger. And the wound, she forced herself to look at it properly. He'd been shot. The hole in his side, just below the ribs, wept blood steadily. No exit wound that she could see, which meant the bullet was still inside. Her medical knowledge, limited to what her mother had taught her and what she'd learned from necessity, did not extend to extracting bullets. "You're going to die," she told him flatly, wringing out a cloth in the hot water. "You know that, right? I can clean this, I can try to stitch it, but if that bullet's touched something important, or if infection sets in—" She shook her head. "I'm not a doctor. I'm just a woman trying not to starve." His eyes opened again, focusing on her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Up close, she could see they were gray, the color of storm clouds. He was younger than she'd first thought. Maybe 35, maybe 40. Hard to tell with that much pain carved into his features. Strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, the kind of face that would be handsome without the death pallor and blood. "Your name," she said, not really expecting an answer. "You have a name?" His lips moved. It took him 3 tries to make sound come out. "Victor?" A pause, each breath clearly costing him. "Hale." The name meant nothing to her. She nodded and began cleaning the wound, working as gently as she could while still being thorough. He flinched but didn't cry out, which told her something about his pain tolerance or his stubbornness or both. "This is going to hurt," she warned, reaching for the carbolic acid. "I'm sorry." She wasn't prepared for his reaction. His entire body went rigid, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist with surprising strength. The sound he made wasn't quite a scream. He seemed determined not to give pain that satisfaction, but it was close. His grip tightened hard enough to bruise, and Alara had to physically pry his fingers away. "Stop that," she snapped. "I'm trying to help you. This needs to be cleaned or you'll die of blood poisoning instead of blood loss. Your choice, but either way, let go of me." He released her, his hand falling back to the bed. His eyes never left her face. Alara worked quickly, cleaning the wound as thoroughly as she dared, then packing it with clean cloth. The bleeding had slowed, at least. She bound it tight with strips torn from an old sheet, wrapping them around his torso, having to shift him to get the fabric underneath. He was burning up, she realized. Fever had already set in. "When were you shot?" she asked, sitting back on her heels. "How long have you been out there?" "Don't know." His voice was fading again, consciousness slipping. "Day. Maybe 2. 2 days. Walking around with a bullet in him for 2 days. Either incredibly lucky or incredibly stupid. Who shot you?" "Doesn't matter." "It might, if they come looking." Something flickered in his eyes. It might have been humor. It might have been resignation. "They will." Alara felt her stomach drop. "That's not comforting." "No." He coughed, winced. "Suppose not." She should have left him outside. Should have walked back into her cabin and bolted the door and let nature take its course. Now she'd brought someone else's war into her home, and she didn't even know what sides existed or what the fight was about. "You need to rest," she said, standing. "I'm going to make broth. You'll drink it if you can, and then you're going to tell me exactly what kind of trouble I've just invited into my life." She thought he might have smiled, but it was hard to tell. His eyes had closed again, his breathing settling into the shallow rhythm of someone conserving strength. Alara moved to the stove and began working with what little she had. Bones from the chicken she'd butchered 2 days ago, an onion going soft, some wild herbs she'd dried in the summer. The broth wouldn't be much, but it would be something. Warmth, nourishment, a gesture toward survival. While it simmered, she sat in the rocking chair and watched the stranger in her bed. Victor Hale. The name still meant nothing. He didn't look like a farmer or a rancher. His clothes were too fine, even covered in blood and trail dust. His hands, glimpsed when he'd grabbed her wrist, weren't calloused in the right places for hard labor. But they weren't soft either. The wind outside had turned into a proper storm, snow beginning to tick against the windows. The cabin creaked and settled around them, small sounds that were usually comforting but now felt ominous. Every noise could be someone approaching, every shadow could be danger. She'd made her choice, though. For better or worse, this man's fate was now tangled with hers. The broth finished cooking, Alara ladled some into a tin cup and returned to the bedside. Victor's eyes opened when she touched his shoulder. "Can you sit up?" she asked. "Even a little?" He tried, failed, tried again with her help, managing to prop himself against the wall behind the bed. The effort left him trembling, sweat beading on his forehead despite the fever. She held the cup to his lips. He drank slowly, carefully, managing 3 small sips before shaking his head. "That's all. For now." She set the cup aside and studied him. In the lamplight, she could see details she'd missed before. A scar through his left eyebrow, calluses on his trigger finger, a quality to his bearing, even half dead and broken, that suggested authority. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "Really?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. Then, "Someone who made powerful enemies. Clearly, and I'm guessing they're not the forgiving type." "No." "So what am I supposed to do when they show up at my door looking for you?" His eyes met hers, and there was something in them now, a desperate kind of calculation. "There's something—" He paused, gathering strength. "I need to write. Important. My saddlebag. Where is it?" Alara frowned. "I didn't see a saddlebag. You just had what you were wearing." "Must have dropped it." Frustration flickered across his face. "Doesn't matter. Paper. Do you have paper? Pen?" "I have a pencil. Some old newsprint I've been saving for kindling." "That will work." She didn't understand, but she retrieved what he'd asked for, smoothing the newsprint on the small table beside the bed and handing him the pencil. His hand shook as he took it, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't be able to write at all. But then he pressed the pencil to paper, and words began to form. Slow, labored, but legible. Alara watched, growing more confused by the second. This wasn't a letter home, wasn't a confession or a warning. It was formal, legal sounding. "What are you writing?" she asked. He didn't answer, focused entirely on the page. Sweat dripped from his forehead onto the newsprint, smudging the edges of words. His breathing had gone ragged again, each inhale sounding wet and painful. Finally he stopped, set down the pencil, looked at her. "Witness," he said. "I need you to witness." "Witness what?" "My signature. Date. Time." He coughed, and blood flecked his lips. "You can write? Read?" "Yes." Her mother had insisted on it, had traded eggs and vegetables to the school teacher for lessons. It had seemed frivolous at the time. Now Alara was grateful. "Then read it." She picked up the paper, angling it toward the lamplight. The handwriting was shaky but clear, and the words didn't make sense. Last will and testament of Victor James Hale. She read it twice, then a third time, then looked at him, certain she was misunderstanding something fundamental. "This is insane," she said. "You're delirious. You don't know what you're writing." "I know exactly." His eyes were clear despite the fever, focused with the kind of intensity that came from knowing time was running out. "My land, my holdings, all of it. To you." "But to me?" Her voice came out as a strangled whisper. You don't even know me. I'm a stranger. You've been in my house for less than 2 hours. You saved my life. I dragged you inside and cleaned a wound. That's not the same thing. That's not worth... She gestured at the paper, at the words that made her head spin. Whatever this is. 53,000 acres, Victor said quietly, spanning 3 territories. Main ranch house, 2 line camps, breeding stock, water rights. Plus investments in the railroad, the bank in Denver, mining operations in Montana. A pause. Worth approximately $400,000. The number was so large it became meaningless. Alara stared at him, trying to reconcile what he was saying with the bleeding man in her bed, the stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere like something from a fever dream. You're lying, she said. Or crazy. Or both. Neither. He coughed again, harder this time, doubling over with the pain of it. When he straightened, there was more blood on his lips. I'm dying. And my sister, Catherine, she'll take everything if I don't do this. She'll destroy everything I built, everyone I tried to protect. So leave it to someone you actually know. A friend, a business partner, anyone but... Alara gestured at herself, at the tiny cabin, at the poverty evident in every corner. Me. Can't trust them. She's already bought most of them. The ones she hasn't bought, she's threatened. His hand found hers, gripping with surprising strength. You're the only one who has nothing to gain from my death. The only one who helped me without knowing. That means something. That means I'm an idiot who's about to inherit a nightmare. Yes. He didn't deny it. But you're strong. I can see it. You've survived out here alone, pregnant. That takes more strength than most men I know. Strength doesn't stop bullets. Doesn't stop your sister, apparently. No? His grip tightened. But the law does. This is legal. Witnessed. Dated. She can fight it, and she will, but she can't break it. Not easily. Alara pulled her hand away, standing, pacing the small confines of the cabin. This was madness, complete madness. She should tear up the paper, throw him back outside, pretend none of this had ever happened. But $400,000, 53,000 acres. Water rights. Breeding stock. $240 by December 1st, or lose everything. I'm going to regret this, she said to the ceiling, to the baby, to whatever forces governed such impossible moments. I know I'm going to regret this. She turned back to Victor Hale, who was watching her with those storm-gray eyes, waiting. If I do this, if I witness this insanity, what happens next? I die, he said simply. Probably tonight, probably before morning, and you become the richest woman in Wyoming territory. And your sister? Catherine will come for you. She'll try to intimidate you, bribe you, destroy you. She'll use every tool she has. He paused. But if you can hold out, if you can get to a judge, present the will. The law will protect you. Eventually. Eventually. Alara laughed, a sound with no humor in it. That's reassuring? It's the best I can offer. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not a dying stranger but a desperate man making the only move left to him. A gamble on a woman he didn't know, in a game she didn't understand, with stakes so high she couldn't comprehend them. And she thought about the $240 she didn't have, about the child who would be born into nothing, about the cabin that would belong to the bank in 2 weeks, about the choice between certain ruin and possible survival. Give me the paper, she said. Victor Hale died at 3 a.m, when the storm outside had reached its full fury and the world beyond the cabin walls had disappeared into white chaos. Alara knew the moment it happened. She'd been dozing in the rocking chair, jerking awake every few minutes to check his breathing, and suddenly the rhythm that had been her anchor through the long night simply stopped. She stood, walked to the bedside, and pressed her fingers to his neck. Nothing. His skin was already cooling, the fever that had burned through him finally extinguished. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful in a way it hadn't been while living. Whatever pain had driven him to her door, whatever enemies had put that bullet in his side, they couldn't touch him anymore. Well, Alara said softly to the empty room. That's that then. She should have felt something, grief perhaps, or fear at being alone with a corpse. Instead, she felt numb, practical. There was a dead man in her bed, a blizzard raging outside, and a piece of newsprint on the table that claimed she now owned half of Wyoming territory. Emotion seemed like an indulgence she couldn't afford. She pulled the quilt up over Victor's face, then turned to the stove and fed it the last of the good wood. The cabin was cold despite the fire, drafts sneaking through every gap in the chinked logs. She made herself tea from the same herbs she'd used for the broth, sat back in the rocking chair, and stared at the will. Last will and testament of Victor James Hale. Her name was there, written in his shaking hand. Alara Margaret Quinn. He'd asked her full name while she'd witnessed the document, and she'd given it without thinking. Now it sat on the page like an accusation, a promise, a sentence. She'd signed as witness, added the date, November 17th, 1887, and the time as he'd instructed. He'd signed below, his signature trailing off at the end as his strength failed. Then he'd folded the paper carefully, pressed it into her hands. "Hide it," he'd said. "Don't tell anyone. Not until you can get to Judge Morrison in Cheyenne. He's honest, one of the few. He'll honor this. Your sister will come looking, within days probably. She has people watching the ranch, watching me. When I don't return, she'll send them out." His eyes had locked on hers. "Tell her nothing. You never saw me. I never came here. You understand? You want me to lie to a woman who apparently kills people for a living? I want you to survive long enough to claim what's yours." Now he was dead, and Alara was alone with his secrets and his fortune and his enemies. The numbness was starting to crack at the edges, letting in something that felt dangerously like panic. She forced it down, made herself breathe slowly, think clearly. First problem, the body. She couldn't bury him, not with the ground frozen solid and 3 feet of snow already on the ground. She couldn't keep him in the cabin either. Aside from the practical problems, if anyone came looking, a corpse would be impossible to explain. The lean-to. It was barely warmer than outside, which meant the cold would preserve him. She could wrap him in canvas, weight him down to keep animals away, and deal with proper burial when the weather cleared. Second problem, the sister, Catherine Hale. Victor had spoken her name with a mix of fear and resignation that suggested she was every bit as dangerous as he'd implied. If she came looking, what would Alara say? How would she explain the tracks in the snow leading to her door, the blood on her quilt, the blood? Alara stood abruptly, staring at the bed. The quilt was ruined, soaked through with Victor's blood. Evidence. Proof that someone had died here, no matter what story she told. She pulled the quilt off the bed and carried it to the stove. Too large to burn all at once, but she could cut it up, feed it to the fire in pieces. The smoke would smell terrible, but the storm would disperse it. By morning, there would be nothing left but ashes. She worked through the pre-dawn hours with grim determination, cut the quilt into strips, burned them one by one, scrubbed the mattress tick with snow melted in the basin, watching pink water swirl and fade to clear, dragged Victor's body to the lean-to, wrapped in the canvas tarp she'd used to cover the woodpile, and secured it with rope and rocks. Every movement made her back ache and the baby kick in protest, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. By the time gray light began filtering through the storm, the cabin looked almost normal, clean, innocent. The only evidence that Victor Hale had ever existed was the piece of newsprint hidden in the tobacco tin behind the hearthstone, and the knowledge burning in Alara's mind like fever. She slept for 2 hours, curled in the rocking chair because she couldn't bring herself to lie in the bed where a man had died. When she woke, the storm had lessened to occasional gusts, and the world outside was buried under snow that looked clean and absolute, erasing all tracks, all traces. The next 3 days passed in a strange suspension of reality. Alara went through her usual routines, feeding the chickens, checking the cattle, rationing her dwindling supplies, while waiting for catastrophe to arrive. Every sound made her jump. Every movement in her peripheral vision became a threat. But no one came. The snow kept falling, lighter now but persistent, and she remained alone. On the 4th day, the weather finally broke. Alara woke to brilliant sunshine and a silence so complete it felt like the world had been remade overnight. She forced herself to check the lean-to. Victor's body was exactly where she'd left it, frozen solid, preserved by the cold. She covered it again and walked away, trying not to think about what she'd have to do when the thaw came. She was feeding the chickens when she heard the horses, 3 riders, approaching from the east. Alara's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She made herself stay calm, scattering the last of the grain before walking slowly back toward the cabin. By the time the riders reached her fence line, she was standing on the porch, one hand resting casually on the post, the other hidden in her apron pocket gripping the hunting knife. The lead rider was a woman. Alara had been expecting men, hired guns, ranch hands, someone rough and threatening. Instead, she got elegance on horseback. The woman sat her mount like she'd been born in the saddle, her posture perfect despite the long ride. She wore a riding habit in deep green wool, tailored so precisely it looked like armor. Her hair, dark and severe, was pulled back under a hat that probably cost more than Alara's entire cabin. But it was her face that caught attention, beautiful in a cold, sharp way, like frost patterns on glass. She was looking at Alara with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock at auction. "Mrs. Quinn?" The woman's voice was cultured, Eastern educated. It made Alara's rough frontier accent feel even rougher by comparison. "That's right." Alara didn't move from her position. "Can I help you?" The woman dismounted with fluid grace, handing her reins to one of the men behind her. They stayed on their horses, big men, hard-faced, wearing guns like natural extensions of their bodies. Hired muscle. Alara had seen the type before. "My name is Catherine Hale," the woman said, walking closer but stopping a respectful distance from the porch. "I'm looking for my brother. I believe he may have passed this way recently." Alara's throat went dry, but she kept her expression neutral. "I haven't seen anyone. Been snowed in for days." Yes, the storm was quite severe. Catherine's eyes swept over the cabin, the outbuildings, the lean-to, looking for something. "My brother was traveling alone. Dark hair, gray eyes, about 40 years old. He would have been injured. Like I said, I haven't seen anyone." Alara shifted slightly, trying to block the sight line to the lean-to. "It's just me out here." "Just you?" Catherine's gaze dropped to Alara's swollen belly, lingered there meaningfully. "That must be difficult. A woman in your condition, all alone." "I manage." "I'm sure you do." Catherine smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Still, this is dangerous country. Anything could happen. Accidents, animals, desperate men looking for shelter." The threat was delivered with such polite precision it took Alara a moment to recognize it as a threat at all. When she did, anger flared hot in her chest, burning away some of the fear. "Are you threatening me, Miss Hale?" "Mrs. Hale, actually. I'm widowed." Catherine's smile widened slightly. "And no, of course not. I'm simply observing that you're in a vulnerable position. It would be terrible if something happened to you, especially if you'd been uncooperative about sharing information that might save a man's life." Alara met her gaze steadily. "I told you, I haven't seen your brother." For a long moment, Catherine just looked at her. Then she turned, gesturing to one of the men. "Marcus, check the outbuildings." "You don't have permission," Alara started, but Catherine cut her off. "I don't need permission to look for my dying brother, Mrs. Quinn. Surely you understand. Family obligation trumps property rights, especially when we're talking about saving a life." The man called Marcus dismounted and walked toward the barn. Alara's mind raced. He'd check the barn, find nothing. Then the chicken coop, the root cellar. Eventually, the lean-to. Eventually, the body. "Wait." The word came out before she could stop it. Catherine's eyes snapped back to her, sharp with interest. Alara forced herself to continue, to commit to the lie. "There was someone, a few days ago, before the worst of the storm." "Yes?" Catherine took a step closer. "Man on foot, moving fast like he was running from something. I watched from the window. He went north toward the tree line." Alara pointed vaguely in that direction. "Didn't stop here. I didn't get a good look at his face." "Injured?" "Couldn't tell. Like I said, I didn't see him close." Catherine studied her, and Alara had the uncomfortable sensation of being dissected. Those eyes missed nothing. The worn fabric of Alara's dress, the desperation poorly hidden behind pride, the exhaustion that came from too many nights with too little sleep. "You're lying," Catherine said pleasantly. Alara's hand tightened on the knife in her pocket. "Excuse me?" "You're lying. I can always tell. It's a gift." Catherine's smile turned predatory. "But I'll tell you what. I'm going to pretend I believe you. My men are going to search your property anyway, just to be thorough. And when they find nothing, because I suspect they won't, I'm going to leave. For now. How generous. Oh, I can be very generous, Mrs. Quinn. I can also be very persistent. Catherine pulled off her gloves slowly, deliberately. My brother controls significant assets: land, money, influence. If he's dead, and I suspect he might be, those assets pass to me. Unless, of course, he did something foolish in his final hours, made some desperate attempt to spite me from beyond the grave. Alara kept her face blank, but her heart was hammering so hard she was certain Catherine could hear it. If that happened, Catherine continued, if someone tried to claim what was mine based on some scrap of paper scribbled by a dying man, well, that would be unfortunate. For them. I wouldn't know anything about that. No, I don't suppose you would. Catherine pulled her gloves back on. But just so we're clear, if my brother came here, if he said anything to you, gave you anything, promised you anything, it means nothing. He had no authority to dispose of his property. I have lawyers who would crush any claim to the contrary. Sounds like you're the one making threats now. I'm simply stating facts. The Hale family has power in this territory, Mrs. Quinn. Power that extends to judges, sheriffs, bankers. Power that could make life very difficult for someone in your position. Catherine's eyes dropped to Alara's belly again, especially someone so vulnerable. The rage that filled Alara then was clean and sharp, cutting through fear like a blade. She pulled her hand from her pocket, empty now, having left the knife behind, and crossed her arms. Your brother isn't here. Wasn't here. I have nothing that belongs to you. So unless you plan to have your men tear my property apart on a guess, I'd appreciate it if you'd finish your search and leave. Catherine's expression flickered. Surprise, maybe, or reassessment. Then she nodded slowly. Marcus, check everything. Thoroughly. The search took an hour. Alara watched from the porch as the two men went through her barn, her root cellar, even the chicken coop. They were professional about it, methodical, and she found herself grateful for the storm that had buried the tracks leading to and from the lean-to. When Marcus finally approached the lean-to itself, she held her breath. He pulled back the tarp covering the woodpile, looked inside, moved a few logs, then replaced the tarp and walked back to Catherine, shaking his head. Nothing, ma'am. No sign anyone's been here recently except her. Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line. She mounted her horse in one smooth motion, looking down at Alara from that elevated position. I'll be watching you, Mrs. Quinn. If my brother surfaces, if any documentation surfaces, if anything at all happens that affects my family's interests, I'll know. And I'll return. Safe travels, Alara said flatly. She watched them ride away, staying on the porch until they disappeared over the eastern ridge. Only then did she allow herself to shake. Her legs gave out and she sat down hard on the top step, wrapping her arms around her belly and letting the terror she'd been holding back wash through her. They'd been within 20 feet of Victor's body and hadn't found it. The canvas, the snow, the angle of the lean-to, something had hidden it from view. Luck. Blind, impossible luck. But luck didn't last. Catherine would be back, or she'd send others. The search wasn't over. It was just beginning. Alara forced herself back inside, pulled the tobacco tin from its hiding place, and stared at the will. Judge Morrison in Cheyenne. That's what Victor had said. Get to Cheyenne, present the will, and the law would protect her. Cheyenne was 80 miles away. 80 miles through winter territory, alone and pregnant, with no horse, no money for stage fare, and enemies who would kill to prevent her from reaching it. Impossible. Completely impossible. She thought about the $240 she owed, about the cabin she'd lose in less than 3 weeks, about the child who would be born into nothing, about Catherine Hale's cold eyes and colder threats, about 53,000 acres and $400,000 and a dead man's desperate gamble. Damn you, Victor Hale, she whispered. Damn you for this. But even as she said it, she was folding the will carefully, slipping it into the inside pocket of her heaviest coat. Making plans, making choices. The next morning, Alara hitched one of the cattle to the old sledge Thomas had built for hauling firewood. The animal was half-starved and temperamental, but it was transport. She loaded what she could. A blanket, the last of the food, a canteen of water, the hunting knife. She left a note for whoever might come looking, claiming she'd gone to stay with family in town until the baby came. Then she wrapped Victor's body in fresh canvas, loaded it onto the sledge, and set out for Cheyenne. She made it 6 miles the first day. The cattle moved at a crawl, fighting her every step, and the sledge kept catching on frozen ruts in the road. By nightfall, she'd found shelter in an abandoned line shack, its roof half caved, but its walls still solid. She brought Victor's body inside, couldn't risk leaving it where animals might get to it, and built a small fire in the remains of the hearth. She talked to him while she worked, which she knew was insane but couldn't seem to stop. "This was a terrible plan," she told the canvas-wrapped corpse. "You know that, right? I'm dragging a dead body across Wyoming in the middle of winter. If I don't freeze to death, I'll probably be arrested for murder. Best case scenario, I look completely insane. Worst case involves your sister." The body, unsurprisingly, offered no response. Alara melted snow for water, ate half a piece of hardtack, and tried to sleep. The baby was restless, kicking steadily, as if protesting the entire enterprise. She couldn't blame it. The second day was harder. The temperature dropped, and the cattle gave out entirely around noon, simply stopping in the middle of the road and refusing to move no matter how much Alara coaxed or threatened. She ended up abandoning the sledge, shouldering the pack with her meager supplies, and continuing on foot. Victor's body she left behind, hidden in a ravine and marked with a cairn of stones so she could find it later. If there was a later. She walked until her feet went numb, until the baby's kicking became painful, until she could barely see straight. When she finally spotted the outline of buildings in the distance, a small settlement, maybe 10 structures clustered around a crossroads, she nearly wept with relief. The settlement was called Broken Creek, and it consisted of a general store, a blacksmith, a boarding house, and several homes that had seen better days. Alara stumbled into the boarding house just as full dark fell, startling the woman at the front desk. "I need a room," Alara said, her voice rough from cold. "Just for tonight." The woman looked her over, the pregnant belly, the worn clothes, the desperation, and her expression softened. "You got money, honey?" Alara had exactly $4.70 left from her original 11. She put $2 on the counter. "That'll do." The woman pocketed the money and handed over a key. "Room 3, top of the stairs. There's a stove, but you'll have to feed it yourself. Breakfast is extra." "Thank you." The room was barely bigger than a closet, but it was warm and had a real bed, and right now that was everything. Alara collapsed onto the mattress without even removing her boots, let exhaustion drag her under, and slept for 12 hours straight. She woke to someone knocking on the door. "Mrs. Quinn? You in there?" Alara sat up, heart pounding. She didn't recognize the voice, didn't know anyone in this town. Carefully, she approached the door. "Who is it?" "Name's Daniel Frost. I run the general store. Sarah, the woman downstairs, she mentioned you came in last night looking pretty rough. Thought you might need supplies." Alara opened the door a crack. The man on the other side was middle-aged, balding, with kind eyes, and the slightly stooped posture of someone who spent their days behind a counter. "I don't have much money," she said. "Wasn't asking for money. You headed somewhere?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Cheyenne." "Cheyenne." He whistled low. "That's a long walk for someone in your condition. You got people there?" "Business." "Must be important business." He studied her for a moment, then made a decision. "My brother runs freight between here and Cheyenne. Leaves tomorrow morning. I could get you a ride, if you're willing to help load and unload." Alara stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because my wife died in childbirth 20 years ago, and she was alone when it happened, far from anyone who could help." His expression was matter-of-fact, but there was old grief in his eyes. "I see a woman on her own, about to have a baby, trying to get somewhere important. I help, simple as that." She wanted to cry, wanted to tell him everything, about Victor, about Catherine, about the impossible inheritance and the terror that followed her like a shadow. Instead, she just said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Ride'll be rough. And Jonas, my brother, he doesn't talk much, but he'll get you there safe." The freight wagon left at dawn. True to Daniel's word, Jonas Frost was a man of few words and fewer questions. He helped Alara into the wagon bed, already half full of crates and barrels, made sure she was secured, and set off without ceremony. They made Cheyenne in 2.5 days. Cheyenne rose from the plains like a promise half kept. Buildings crowded together in defiance of the emptiness surrounding them, their false fronts painted bright against the winter sky. Alara had been here only once before, years ago with Thomas, and she'd thought it grand then. A real city with boardwalks and glass windows and more people than she'd ever seen in one place. Now climbing stiffly from Jonas Frost's wagon, every muscle screaming protest, she saw it differently. The grandness was still there, but so was something harder. Money moved through these streets like blood through veins, and where money went, power followed. "You need help finding your people?" Jonas asked, his first complete sentence since they'd left Broken Creek. "I'll manage. Thank you for the ride." He nodded, already turning his attention to the freight manifest. Alara shouldered her pack and walked into the city, trying to look like she belonged. Hard to do when you were 7 months pregnant, wearing clothes that hadn't been clean in a week, and carrying everything you owned on your back. People noticed. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed. Others stared openly, making calculations about her circumstances that showed plainly on their faces. She found a boarding house on the edge of the commercial district, cheaper than the ones near the train station but still respectable. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Adelaide Chen, according to the sign, took one look at Alara and quoted a price that was almost fair. $2 for the week, 50 cents extra if you want meals, shared washroom down the hall, no men visitors, no cooking in the rooms, no noise after 9. Alara counted out the money, watching her remaining funds dwindle to almost nothing. Mrs. Chen handed over a key without comment, though her eyes lingered on Alara's belly. "Baby due soon?" "Month and a half, maybe 2. You got people here? Someone to help when the time comes?" "I'll be fine." Mrs. Chen's expression said she'd heard that particular lie before and knew exactly how it ended, but she didn't push, just pointed toward the stairs. "Room 7, 2nd floor, faces the street. Try to eat something, child. You look half dead." The room was small but clean, with an actual bed frame and a window that closed properly. Alara dropped her pack, sat on the edge of the bed, and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes to acknowledge the magnitude of what she was attempting. Then she pulled out the will, smoothed it carefully, and studied it again in the afternoon light. Judge Morrison. That was her target. Victor had been clear about that. But how did one simply walk into a judge's chambers and present a document claiming ownership of $400,000 in assets? Especially when the person presenting it was a pregnant widow with no money, no connections, and no proof beyond a piece of newsprint covered in shaky handwriting. She needed help. Someone who understood law, who could navigate the systems that governed such things. A lawyer, ideally, though lawyers cost money she didn't have. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she'd figure it out. Tonight she'd sleep in a real bed and pretend just for a few hours that the weight of the impossible wasn't crushing her. She woke before dawn to the sound of voices in the street below. Men heading to work probably, or coming back from the saloons that stayed open all night. Alara lay still, feeling the baby move inside her, and tried to construct a plan from the fragments of hope she had left. First, locate Judge Morrison's office. Second, somehow gain an audience. Third, present the will and pray he was as honest as Victor had believed. Fourth, survive whatever Catherine Hale did when she found out. The fourth step was where the plan fell apart, but Alara pushed that worry aside. One catastrophe at a time. She washed as best she could with the icy water from the shared washroom, changed into her least dirty dress, and went downstairs. Mrs. Chen was in the kitchen, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon made Alara's stomach clench with hunger. "You eating?" Mrs. Chen asked. Alara hesitated. She had maybe $1.20 left, but starving herself wouldn't help anyone, least of all the baby. "Yes, please." The meal was simple. Eggs, bacon, bread with butter, but it was the best thing Alara had tasted in weeks. She ate slowly, trying to make it last, while Mrs. Chen moved around the kitchen with the efficient grace of someone who'd been running a boarding house for decades. "You looking for work?" the older woman asked, not quite casually. "Not exactly. I need to find someone. Judge Morrison. Do you know where his office is?" Mrs. Chen paused, turning to look at Alara with new interest. "Judge Morrison. Now there's a name. Territorial Courthouse, north end of Capitol Avenue. Can't miss it. Big stone building with columns." She wiped her hands on her apron. What business you got with a territorial judge? Legal matter. Must be serious, you coming all this way. It is. Mrs. Chen studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Word of advice, child. Judge Morrison's a good man, but he's surrounded by people who aren't. You go walking in there with whatever trouble you're carrying, you better be ready for it to get worse before it gets better. I don't have much choice. That's usually how it goes. Mrs. Chen returned to the stove. You need anything? Someone to watch your back, place to hide if things go sideways. You come find me. I don't ask questions, and I don't gossip. Learned a long time ago that the women who end up in my rooms are usually running from something. Sometimes they deserve to get caught. More often, they don't. The kindness was so unexpected, it nearly undid Alara's carefully maintained composure. She blinked hard, swallowed, and managed, Thank you. The courthouse was exactly where Mrs. Chen had said it would be, and exactly as impressive as promised. Stone columns, marble steps, doors heavy enough to withstand a siege. Alara stood at the bottom of those steps for a full minute, gathering courage, before forcing herself to climb. Inside, the building was all echoes and authority. Men in suits moved through the corridors with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they belonged. Alara, dusty and obviously out of place, drew stairs. She ignored them, found a clerk sitting behind a desk that looked older than the territory itself, and cleared her throat. Excuse me, I need to see Judge Morrison. The clerk looked up, took in her appearance, and returned his attention to his paperwork. Judge Morrison doesn't see people without an appointment. It's urgent. So is everyone's business. Make an appointment. I need to see him today. The clerk sighed, the long-suffering sound of someone who dealt with desperate people regularly and had long since stopped caring. Judge Morrison is currently in session. He'll be in session until 4 o'clock. After that, he has meetings scheduled until 6. His first available appointment is 3 weeks from Thursday. 3 weeks. Catherine would have found her by then. Would have destroyed any chance she had of claiming the inheritance. I can't wait 3 weeks. Then I suggest you take it up with the judge's calendar, not me. Alara felt panic rising in her chest, threatening to spill over into something embarrassing like tears or shouting. She forced it down, made herself think. Is there anyone else who handles estates, inheritance disputes? That would be probate court, Judge Harrison. His clerk is down the hall, second door on the left. It wasn't Morrison, but it was something. Alara thanked him and went in search of the second door on the left. The clerk there was younger, a woman with ink-stained fingers and a harried expression. Help you? She asked without looking up. I need to file an inheritance claim. That got her attention. The clerk looked up, her eyes sharp with professional interest. You have documentation? Alara pulled out the will, unfolded it carefully, and placed it on the desk. The clerk picked it up, read it once, then read it again more slowly. Her expression went from interested to shocked to deeply skeptical. This claims you're inheriting the Hale estate. Yes. The entire Hale estate. That's what it says. The clerk set the document down like it might explode. You understand what you're claiming here? The Hale family controls more land and capital than anyone in 3 territories. This document, if it's legitimate, would make you one of the wealthiest women west of the Mississippi. I understand. Who wrote this? Victor Hale, before he died. And you have proof of his death? Alara's throat went dry. The body. She'd left Victor's body in a ravine outside Broken Creek, marked with stones but unburied, unrecorded, unproven. He died in my cabin. I can testify to that. Testimony isn't proof. You'll need a death certificate signed by a doctor or coroner. You'll need witnesses to the signing of this will. I see your signature here as witness, but that's not sufficient when you're also the beneficiary. You'll need... The clerk broke off, shaking her head. Honestly, ma'am, you'll need a lawyer, a good one. This isn't something you can navigate alone. I can't afford a lawyer. Then you can't afford to pursue this claim. The clerk's tone wasn't unkind, but it was final. The Hale family has attorneys on retainer who will tear this apart. They'll question every aspect, the validity of the signature, your relationship to the deceased, the circumstances of his death, your mental competency to witness a legal document. Without professional representation, you'll be destroyed in court. Alara picked up the will, folded it, put it back in her pocket. Her hands were shaking. If I found a lawyer, if I came back with proper representation, would Judge Harrison hear the case? If the documentation is in order, yes, but I'm warning you now, the Hale family won't let this go unchallenged. Catherine Hale is already the recognized heir to Victor Hale's estate. She has possession of the properties, access to the accounts. She'll fight this with everything she has. I know. Do you? The clerk leaned forward, her expression serious. I've seen inheritance disputes destroy people, families torn apart, fortunes spent on legal fees, lives ruined over money that never even changes hands. And that's between people with equal resources. You're talking about taking on one of the most powerful families in the territory, alone, pregnant, with nothing but a questionable document and your word. It's not questionable. Victor Hale wrote it. I witnessed it. It's legal. Legal and enforceable are two different things. The clerk sat back. My advice? Walk away. Find some other way to survive. This fight will kill you. Alara met her eyes steadily. I'm already dying. Slowly, maybe, but just as certainly. I owe more money than I can ever earn. I'm about to lose everything I have. My child will be born into nothing, and I'll likely die bringing it into the world because I can't afford a doctor. So yes, this fight might kill me, but at least it's a fight. At least there's a chance. The clerk was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out a piece of paper, wrote something on it, and slid it across the desk. Thomas Garrett, lawyer, has an office on 15th Street above the haberdashery. He's young, he's stubborn, and he has a reputation for taking cases no one else will touch. She paused. He's also honest, which is rarer than you'd think in this profession. Tell him Rachel Chen sent you. Alara looked at the name written in neat script, then back at the clerk. Chen. You're related to Adelaide Chen? She's my aunt. And yes, she already sent word that you were coming and that I should help if I could. Rachel's expression softened slightly. My aunt has good instincts about people. If she thinks you're worth helping, then maybe you are. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Garrett might refuse the case. Even if he takes it, you've got a long road ahead, but at least you'll have a chance. Sometimes that's all anyone gets. Thomas Garrett's office was exactly where Rachel had said it would be, up a narrow staircase that smelled like old wood and newer tobacco. The door at the top bore his name in plain lettering. No flourishes, no pretension. Alara knocked. It's open. The office inside was small and surprisingly chaotic. Books everywhere, stacked on the desk, piled on the floor, crammed into shelves that looked like they were threatening structural collapse. Papers scattered across every surface. A coat hanging from a hat stand that leaned at a dangerous angle. And in the middle of it all, a man who couldn't have been more than 30, with rumpled dark hair and eyes that were too sharp for his young face. He looked up from the document he was reading, took in Alara's appearance, and set down his pen. You look like trouble. I am. Good. Boring cases put me to sleep. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit before you fall over. You look exhausted. Alara sat, grateful for the chance to take weight off her feet. Rachel Chen sent me. Rachel. He smiled, genuine warmth transforming his face. How is she? Busy. She said you take cases other lawyers won't. That's a polite way of saying I'm either very brave or very stupid. Jury's still out on which. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. So what kind of trouble are we talking about? Debt, divorce, criminal charges? Inheritance dispute. His eyebrows went up. Interesting. Who died? Victor Hale. The change in Garrett's expression was immediate and dramatic. He sat forward, all traces of casual humor gone. Victor Hale is dead? Yes. When? 6 days ago. And you're claiming what exactly? Alara pulled out the will and handed it across the desk. Garrett read it in absolute silence, his expression growing more incredulous with each line. When he finished, he read it again. Then he set it down very carefully and looked at her. This is insane. So I've been told. No, I mean, this is genuinely, monumentally insane. He tapped the document. Victor Hale was worth more than some small countries. He had business interests across 3 territories. And according to this, he left everything to, He checked the name. Alara Quinn. That's you? Yes. Why? It was the question everyone would ask, Alara realized. The question she'd asked herself 100 times. She told him the truth. Because I saved his life, or tried to. He showed up at my cabin, shot, dying. I took him in, treated his wound. He knew he wasn't going to survive, so he wrote the will. Made me witness it. Died a few hours later. You have proof of any of this? His body is in a ravine outside a settlement called Broken Creek. I can take you there. The wound is real. The circumstances are exactly as I said. But no other witnesses to the actual signing? No. No doctor's certification of death? No. And Catherine Hale, his sister, who stands to lose everything if this will is honored, she's already looking for you? She came to my cabin, searched the property, threatened me. Garrett was quiet, his fingers drumming against the desk. Alara watched him think, saw the calculations happening behind his eyes. Finally, he spoke. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Quinn. This is the longest of long shots. Catherine Hale has resources you can't imagine. She'll hire the best lawyers money can buy. She'll bribe witnesses, intimidate judges, use every dirty trick in the book to prevent this will from being honored. And she'll probably succeed. Alara felt hope crumbling. So you won't take the case? I didn't say that. Garrett picked up the will again, studying it. What I said was it's a long shot, but long shots are how you make history, and I've never been one to turn down a fight just because it's hard. He looked at her directly. But I need to know, are you prepared for what this will cost? Not in money, though that's a factor. I mean in every other way. Your privacy will be destroyed. Your reputation will be attacked. Catherine will dig into every aspect of your life looking for leverage. If you have secrets, they'll come out. If you have weaknesses, they'll be exploited. This will be brutal. I understand. Do you? He leaned forward, his expression intense. Because I've seen strong men break under less pressure than what you're about to face, and you're... He gestured at her, at the visible evidence of her pregnancy, her poverty, her vulnerability. Not exactly in a position of strength. The anger that flared in Alara's chest was hot and bright. She stood, placing both hands flat on his desk, leaning close enough that he couldn't miss the steel in her voice. Don't confuse weakness with vulnerability, Mr. Garrett. I've been managing a failing ranch alone while pregnant and broke. I've survived my husband's death, a Wyoming winter, and a visit from Catherine Hale that would have sent most men running. I dragged a dead body halfway across the territory because I knew it was the only proof I'd have. I'm here, aren't I? Still standing, still fighting, so don't you dare tell me I'm not strong enough for this. A slow smile spread across Garrett's face. There it is. That's what I needed to see. He stood, extending his hand across the desk. Welcome to the longest, hardest fight of your life, Mrs. Quinn. Let's go make some history. They spent the next 3 hours planning strategy. Garrett asked questions, hundreds of them, about Victor, about the circumstances of his death, about Catherine's visit, about every detail Alara could remember. He took notes in shorthand that looked like another language entirely, occasionally stopping to reference one of the many books scattered around his office. First thing we need is the body, he said finally. Without proof of death, we can't even file the will for probate. We'll need to retrieve it, get a doctor to certify the death and the cause, establish a timeline. How long will that take? Depends on the weather and how fast we can move. Few days to get to Broken Creek, few more to get back. Call it a week, maybe more. I don't have a week. Alara's hand moved to her belly, an unconscious gesture. Catherine knows I'm in Cheyenne by now. She'll have people looking. Which is why you're going to stay out of sight. Adelaide Chen's boarding house. You're safe there? I think so. Good. Stay there. Don't go out unless absolutely necessary. I'll handle the trip to Broken Creek. He paused. You trust me enough to do this without you. Did she? Trust was expensive, and Alara had learned not to spend it lightly. But Garrett had believed her when no one else had taken her case when every rational calculation said he shouldn't, and the alternative was trying to do this herself, which was impossible in her current state. Yes, she said, I trust you. Then we have a deal. I'll leave tomorrow at first light. With any luck, I'll be back within the week with everything we need to file this properly. He stood, gathering papers. In the meantime, you rest, eat, take care of yourself and that baby, because once this thing starts moving, there won't be time for rest. Alara stood as well, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was fading, leaving behind the kind of bone-deep tiredness that made even standing feel like work.
What do I owe you for this?
Let's survive the first round before we talk about payment. If we win, and that's a big if, you'll have more money than you know what to do with. We can settle accounts then. And if we lose, Garrett's smile was crooked, resigned. Then we'll both be too broke to worry about it. She left his office as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, making her way back to the boarding house through streets that had grown crowded with evening traffic. The city felt different now, not safer exactly, but less immediately hostile. She had an ally, a plan, a chance. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had yesterday. Mrs. Chen was in the kitchen when Alara returned, and the smell of cooking made her stomach clench with hunger again despite the breakfast she'd eaten hours ago. "You look like you've had a day," the older woman observed. "That's one way to put it. Rachel sent word, said you met with young Garrett." Mrs. Chen ladled stew into a bowl, handed it across. "Eat. You can tell me about it if you want, or not. Either way, you need food." Alara ate and found herself talking anyway. Not about the specifics, those felt too dangerous to share, even here, but about the shape of things, about having a lawyer, about the fight ahead, about the week of waiting that stretched before her like a chasm. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, washing dishes while Alara spoke. When the story wound down, she dried her hands and turned to face her. "My husband died 20 years ago," she said. "Left me this building and nothing else. People told me to sell, that I couldn't run it alone, that I'd fail within a year. I'm still here." She paused. "What I'm saying is, people underestimate women all the time, especially women they think are powerless. You let them keep thinking that. Let them underestimate you. Then you hit them where it hurts. Catherine Hale isn't the type to underestimate anyone. Maybe not, but she's the type to think money and power are the only things that matter. You've got something she doesn't. What's that?" "Nothing to lose." Mrs. Chen's smile was sharp. "Someone with nothing to lose is the most dangerous person in any fight. You remember that." Alara spent the next 6 days in a kind of suspended animation. She stayed in her room mostly, venturing out only for meals or brief walks when the walls felt too close. She wrote letters she'd probably never send, to the bank, explaining she wouldn't be able to make the payment, to the neighbors back home, asking them to watch over her property if they could. She talked to the baby, telling it stories about its father, about the future that might exist if everything went right. Mostly, she waited. Garrett returned on the 7th day, covered in road dust and looking exhausted but triumphant. Alara met him in Mrs. Chen's parlor, where he'd sent word he'd be waiting. "Got it," he said without preamble, pulling folded documents from his coat. "Death certificate, signed by Dr. Whitmore in Broken Creek. Certified cause of death, gunshot wound to the torso, resulting in internal hemorrhaging and organ failure. Time of death matches your timeline. The body's been properly buried now, in the town cemetery. I've got witness statements from Jonas Frost and his brother Daniel about transporting you to Cheyenne, and from the doctor about the condition of the body when recovered." Alara felt tears pricking her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning." He spread the documents on the table. "Tomorrow morning, we file the will with probate court. Judge Harrison will review it, set a hearing date. That's when things get interesting. Catherine will be notified, and she'll have the opportunity to contest, which she absolutely will." "How long until the hearing?" "Standard is 30 days, but given the size of the estate and the parties involved, it could be longer. Judge might want time to review everything thoroughly." 30 days. A month of waiting, of hiding, of wondering if every knock on the door was Catherine coming to destroy her, but also a month for the baby to keep growing, for her strength to return. Time could be an ally or an enemy. She'd just have to wait and see which. "There's something else," Garrett said, his expression turning serious. "Catherine's in Cheyenne, has been for 3 days. She's staying at the Inner Ocean Hotel, and word is she's meeting with lawyers. A lot of lawyers. She knows something's coming." "How does she know I'm here?" "Probably doesn't, for certain. But she's not stupid. Victor disappears, turns up dead, and suddenly there's activity around his estate. She'd be a fool not to prepare. He paused. You need to be careful, Mrs. Quinn, more careful than you've been. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't trust anyone you don't know. And if you see anyone watching you, anyone following you, you come find me immediately. Fear curled in Alara's stomach, cold and familiar. But underneath it was something else, something that felt almost like anticipation. The fight was about to begin, and this time she wasn't facing it alone. The filing happened at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning that felt like the edge of something irreversible. Alara stood beside Thomas Garrett in the probate clerk's office, watching Rachel Chen process the documents with the same careful efficiency she'd shown during their first meeting. The will, the death certificate, the witness statements, each paper was examined, stamped, recorded in the massive ledger that tracked the legal dissolution of lives into assets and debts. This will be posted publicly within the hour, Rachel said, not looking up from her work. Notice of probate, notice to creditors, notice to interested parties. Anyone with a claim against the estate has 30 days to file. The hearing is set for January 15th. January 15th. 7 weeks away. 7 weeks of waiting while Catherine mobilized her forces, and Alara's baby grew heavier and the winter deepened around them. Catherine Hale will be notified? Garrett asked. She's listed as next of kin. She'll receive formal notice by courier before end of business today. Rachel looked up then, her expression grave. Once that happens, all hell is going to break loose. You both understand that? Alara nodded. She understood perfectly. Right now, Catherine suspected something. By tonight, she'd know everything, and then the real war would begin. They left the courthouse together, Garrett carrying the copies of all filed documents in a leather satchel that looked older than he was. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of Wyoming winter day that hurt to breathe but made everything sharp and clear. Alara pulled her coat tighter, felt the baby kick in response to the sudden movement. You should go back to the boarding house, Garrett said. Stay inside. Mrs. Chen knows what's happening, and she'll make sure you're protected. Protected from what? Catherine can't just break down the door and drag me into the street. Can't she? Garrett's expression was serious. You're about to become the focal point of the biggest inheritance dispute this territory has ever seen. Catherine Hale is going to come at you with everything she has. Legal challenges, yes, but also intimidation, bribery, character assassination. She'll find every piece of dirt in your past and use it against you. She'll turn public opinion, buy witnesses, make you look like a con artist or worse. Let her try. The words came out braver than Alara felt, but she meant them. I'm not lying. I didn't steal anything. Victor gave me that inheritance of his own free will, and I have the documentation to prove it. Documentation can be challenged. Handwriting can be questioned. Mental competency at the time of signing can be disputed. Garrett stopped walking, turned to face her directly. I need you to understand what we're up against. Catherine will argue that Victor was delirious from fever, that he didn't know what he was signing, that you took advantage of a dying man. She'll paint you as a predator who saw an opportunity and seized it. She'd be lying. Of course she would, but lies told with enough money behind them become truth in people's minds. That's how power works. They'd reached the boarding house. Mrs. Chen was sweeping the front steps, her movements methodical and unhurried. She looked up as they approached, took in their expressions, and set the broom aside. It's done? It's done, Garrett confirmed. Catherine will know by tonight. Then you better come inside, both of you. I'll make tea and we can talk about what happens next. The kitchen was warm and smelled like bread baking. Mrs. Chen poured tea from a pot that had been steeping on the stove, handed cups around, and sat down with the air of someone preparing for a long conversation. First thing Catherine will do is try to buy you off, she said, directing the comment at Alara. She'll send someone, probably a lawyer, maybe one of her business associates, with an offer. Cash payment in exchange for withdrawing your claim. It'll seem generous. Might even be more money than you've ever seen in your life. I won't take it. Good. Because the moment you do, you lose everything. Not just the inheritance, but any leverage you have. You become someone who tried to extort the Hale family and failed. Mrs. Chen sipped her tea. Second thing she'll do is investigate you. Your past, your family, your marriage, your finances. She'll be looking for anything that makes you look untrustworthy or unstable. Alara felt a flutter of anxiety. Her past wasn't scandalous, but it wasn't pristine either. There's nothing to find. I'm nobody. I was married, my husband died. I tried to keep the ranch going and couldn't. That's the whole story. Everyone has something, Mrs. Chen said gently. Debt, for instance. How much do you owe? The bank. $240. Due December 1st. The date was 2 weeks away now, though it felt like another lifetime. I already lost the land. Probably lost the cabin too, unless Garrett can work some legal miracle. Garrett had been quiet, thinking. Now he spoke up. Actually, that might work in our favor. Catherine will absolutely use the debt against you, claim you were desperate enough to forge a will or manipulate a dying man. But it also establishes motive for why Victor might have helped you. You were genuinely in need, not some scheming opportunist. I was in need, Ilara said. I still am. That doesn't make me a liar. No, it doesn't. But we need to control the narrative before Catherine does. Garrett pulled out a notebook, started writing. We'll get ahead of this. File an affidavit detailing exactly what happened. Victor's arrival, his injury, the circumstances of the will. Make it public record before Catherine can twist it. We'll also track down anyone who knew Victor, see if we can find people willing to testify about his character, his mental state, his relationship with Catherine. His relationship with Catherine was terrible, Ilara said, remembering Victor's words in those final hours. He said she'd bought or threatened most of his business associates, said she'd destroy everything he'd built. Did he say why he didn't trust her? Ilara tried to remember. The night was a blur of exhaustion and fear, but certain details stood out. He said she was ruthless, that she cared more about power than people. He wanted to protect the people who worked for him, the ranchers who depended on the land. She paused. He said I was the only one who helped him without knowing who he was, without having an agenda. Garrett wrote furiously. That's good. That establishes his state of mind, his reasoning. We can build a case around that. Victor is a man trying to protect his legacy from someone he knew would corrupt it. You're going to make me sound like a saint, Ilara said dryly. I'm not. I helped him because leaving him to die felt wrong, not because I'm some kind of frontier angel. And I'm keeping the inheritance because I need it, not because I want to honor his memory or protect his legacy. Let's be clear about that. Honesty is good, Mrs. Chen said. Juries appreciate honesty. Makes you more believable than someone who pretends to be perfect. There won't be a jury, Garrett corrected. Probate hearings are decided by the judge alone. But the principle holds. We present you as you are, a woman who made a humane choice in difficult circumstances and is now trying to honor a legal document. Nothing more, nothing less. They talked for another hour, planning and strategizing until Garrett had to leave for another appointment and Mrs. Chen had to attend to her other boarders. Ilara went upstairs to her room, lay down on the bed, and tried to rest. The baby was active today, tumbling and kicking like it could sense the tension in her body. She placed both hands on her belly, felt the movements beneath her palms, and wondered what kind of world she was bringing this child into. Either one of wealth and security beyond imagining, or one of crushing poverty and public humiliation. No middle ground, no safe harbor, just those two extremes separated by 7 weeks and whatever happened in a courtroom in January. The knock came 3 days later, early evening when the light was failing and Ilara was helping Mrs. Chen prepare dinner. A firm, official sound that made everyone in the kitchen stop what they were doing. Mrs. Chen wiped her hands on her apron. I'll get it. You stay here. But Ilara followed anyway, stopping at the kitchen door where she could see but not be immediately visible. Mrs. Chen opened the front door to reveal a man in an expensive suit, his posture radiating professional courtesy and underlying threat in equal measure. Good evening. I'm looking for Mrs. Ilara Quinn. Who's asking? My name is Richard Pemberton. I represent the Hale family interests. He held out a card. I'd like to speak with Mrs. Quinn if she's available. She's not. I see. Pemberton's smile didn't waver. Perhaps you could give her a message. The Hale family would like to resolve this matter quickly and amicably. We're prepared to offer Mrs. Quinn $10,000 in exchange for withdrawing her claim to the estate. $10,000. The number hit Ilara like a physical blow. More money than Thomas had made in his entire life. More money than she could earn in 20 years. Enough to pay off every debt, buy new land, secure her child's future. Mrs. Chen's expression didn't change. I'll pass along the message. We'd need an answer by Monday. The offer is time-sensitive and non-negotiable. Pemberton's eyes flickered past Mrs. Chen, scanning the interior of the house. If Mrs. Quinn is wise, she'll accept. The alternative is a legal battle she can't win, and public scrutiny she won't survive. The message will be delivered. Mrs. Chen's tone made it clear the conversation was over. Good evening, Mr. Pemberton. She closed the door firmly, turned the lock, and walked back to the kitchen where Alara was standing with both hands pressed against the doorframe, trying to steady herself. $10,000, Alara whispered. It's a trap. Mrs. Chen returned to the stove, her movements deliberately casual. They're trying to see if you can be bought. If you take it, they know you're not serious about fighting. If you refuse, they know you're committed, and they'll escalate. But $10,000 is nothing compared to what you're actually claiming. Victor Hale's estate is worth 40 times that, 100 times. Catherine's offering you scraps to see if you'll give up the feast. Mrs. Chen turned, met Alara's eyes. Question is, are you hungry enough to hold out? Alara thought about the cabin she'd already lost, about the $240 she could never pay, about 7 months of slow starvation and desperate choices, about dragging a dead man's body across frozen territory because it was the only proof she had. I didn't come this far to settle for scraps, she said. She found Garrett at his office the next morning, showed him Pemberton's card, repeated the offer. His reaction was immediate and predictable. Absolutely not. You take that money, you lose everything. The estate, the credibility, any chance of... I know, Alara interrupted. I'm not taking it. But I wanted you to know they made the offer. Garrett relaxed slightly. Good. That's actually useful information. Shows they're worried. If they thought they could crush you in court, they wouldn't bother trying to buy you off. Or they're trying to make me look greedy when I refuse. She was offered a generous settlement and demanded more. Possibly, but we can counter that. You're not demanding anything. You're simply asking that a legal will be honored. He made a note. I'll draft a response declining the offer, keeping it professional and brief. No emotion, no explanation. Just thank you, but no. The response was delivered that afternoon. By evening, the escalation began. It started with whispers.
Alara couldn't hear them directly, but she could feel them, the subtle shift in how people looked at her when she ventured out for supplies or a walk. Eyes that lingered too long, conversations that stopped when she approached. Someone was spreading stories, planting seeds of doubt. Then came the newspaper article. Mrs. Chen brought it up to Alara's room, her expression grim. The headline read, Mysterious Widow Claims Hale Fortune. Family Questions Legitimacy. Alara read it twice, her hands shaking with rage. The article painted her exactly as Garrett had predicted. An opportunistic stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere to claim one of the territory's great fortunes based on dubious documentation. It mentioned her poverty, her debt, her isolation. It quoted sources close to the family, saying Victor Hale had been mentally unstable in his final days, prone to erratic behavior and poor judgment. They didn't even get the details right, she said, pointing to a line claiming she'd been traveling with Victor when he died. I wasn't traveling with him. He came to me, already injured. Truth doesn't matter to them, Mrs. Chen said. Only what people believe. And people believe what they read in newspapers, especially when it confirms what they already suspect, that poor people who suddenly claim wealth are usually lying. Garrett arrived within the hour, having seen the same article.
His face was set in an expression Alara was beginning to recognize as his fighting stance. We respond, he said without preamble. Not in the newspapers, that's their game, and they have more money to play it. We respond through the court. I'm filing a motion to expedite the hearing, citing harassment and intimidation. We're also going to file affidavits from everyone who can corroborate your story. Jonas Frost, his brother, Dr. Whitmore, even Mrs. Chen and Rachel about your arrival in Cheyenne. Will it help? It establishes a pattern, shows that Catherine is trying to poison public opinion before the legal process can run its course. Judge Harrison doesn't like that kind of thing. He's a stickler for proper procedure. The motion was filed. The affidavits were submitted. And Catherine's next move arrived 48 hours later in the form of a criminal complaint. Elara was arrested on a Friday afternoon in full view of everyone on Capitol Avenue. Two territorial marshals appeared at the boarding house, so with a warrant charging her with fraud, forgery, and theft by deception. Mrs. Chen tried to intervene, but the marshals were polite and implacable. Elara was handcuffed, carefully, given her condition, and escorted to a waiting wagon. The ride to the territorial jail was mercifully short. The humiliation was not. People stared. Some pointed. One man spat in the street as she passed. This was Catherine's work, Elara knew. This was the price of refusing to be bought. She was processed, fingerprinted, photographed. The matron who handled her was not unkind, but she was thorough, and by the time Elara was locked in a cell, she was shaking with exhaustion and fear. The cell was small, cold, with a narrow cot and a bucket in the corner. Not cruel exactly, but designed to break spirits. Garrett appeared 2 hours later, furious and energized in equal measure. "This is retaliation," he said through the bars. "Pure, obvious retaliation. Catherine filed a criminal complaint the day after you refused her buyout. I'm getting you out of here." "How? I don't have bail money." "You won't need it. I'm filing an emergency motion to dismiss. The charges are baseless. You can't forge a document that's witnessed and signed by the person who wrote it. This is harassment, and Judge Morrison will see it for what it is." "Judge Morrison? I thought Harrison was handling the probate." "Harrison is, but criminal charges go through Morrison's court, which is actually lucky for us because Morrison is honest and he hates this kind of legal manipulation." Garrett gripped the bars. "You need to hold on for one more night. I know it's terrible, but I promise you this ends tomorrow." One night felt like an eternity. Elara sat on the cot, arms wrapped around her belly, and tried not to let the fear consume her. The baby was moving constantly now, responding to her stress with kicks and tumbles that were almost painful. She talked to it, whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "We're going to be okay. Your mother isn't going to let them win. I came too far, fought too hard. One night in a cell isn't going to break me." But she wasn't certain. Exhaustion was making her doubt everything. Maybe she should have taken the 10,000. Maybe this fight was too big, the stakes too high. Maybe... No. She stopped that line of thinking forcibly. Doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. Catherine wanted her to break, wanted her to give up, wanted her to disappear back into poverty and obscurity where she belonged. Every moment Elara stayed strong was a victory Catherine couldn't claim. Morning came eventually. A matron brought water and stale bread. Elara ate, washed her face, and waited. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Then, finally, footsteps in the corridor, keys rattling, the cell door swinging open. "You're free to go," the matron said. "Charges dismissed." Garrett was waiting in the front office, along with Mrs. Chen and Rachel. They surrounded Elara the moment she emerged, a protective wall between her and the stares of the jail staff. Judge Morrison called the charges exactly what they were: harassment and abuse of process, Garrett said as they walked quickly toward the street. He not only dismissed them, he issued a formal rebuke to the prosecutor who filed them. Catherine just made herself look desperate and vindictive in front of a territorial judge. That's going to cost her. Outside, the morning was bright and cold. Elara breathed deep, feeling the ache in her back, the exhaustion in her bones, but also something else. Something that felt almost like triumph. "She's going to keep coming," she said. "This won't stop her." "No," Garrett agreed, "but we're building a record now. Every attack she makes, every dirty trick she tries, it goes in the file. By the time we get to the probate hearing, we'll be able to show a pattern of intimidation and bad faith. That matters." They reached the boarding house. Mrs. Chen immediately took charge, steering Elara toward the kitchen and forcing hot food into her hands. Rachel stayed close, her protective instincts making her scan every window, every shadow. "You need to be more careful," she said. "Catherine's escalating. The arrest was a warning. Next time it could be worse." "What could be worse than being arrested?" Rachel and Mrs. Chen exchanged glances. Then Mrs. Chen spoke, her voice lower than usual. "There are other ways to destroy a person. Ways that don't leave legal trails. Accidents happen. People disappear. Especially people who don't have family or connections to raise alarms when they're gone." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Elara set down her fork, appetite gone. You think Catherine would have me killed? I think Catherine would do whatever she thought necessary to protect what she sees as hers, Mrs. Chen said. And I think you need to start considering possibilities you'd rather not think about. The next 3 weeks were a study in controlled paranoia. Alora didn't leave the boarding house except in the company of others. Garrett hired a man, a former marshal named Jack Cordell, to watch the building and make sure no one suspicious approached. Mrs. Chen kept the doors locked at all times, something she'd never done before. Meanwhile, Garrett worked. He tracked down former employees of Victor Hale, people who'd worked the ranches or managed the properties. Most were too frightened of Catherine to speak, but a few, older men mostly, with less to lose, agreed to provide statements about Victor's character and mental state. All of them described him as sharp, capable, fully in control of his faculties until the day he disappeared. He wasn't the type to make rash decisions, one former foreman told Garrett, and his words were recorded in an affidavit. If he wrote that will, he meant it. Victor Hale never did anything by accident. Evidence accumulated, witness statements, financial records showing Catherine had been systematically taking control of Hale properties even before Victor's death, documentation of threats she'd made to business partners who disagreed with her methods. And slowly, a picture emerged of Victor Hale as a man trying to protect something from someone he knew would destroy it. A man who'd made a desperate, last-minute decision to place his legacy in the hands of a stranger because strangers were the only people his sister hadn't corrupted. December arrived with fresh snow and bitter cold. Alara's due date was approaching, 6 weeks away, maybe less. Her body was changing, preparing, and she could feel the subtle shifts that meant the baby was settling lower, getting ready. Mrs. Chen noticed too, started making preparations. Clean linens set aside. A doctor identified and put on retainer, paid with money borrowed from Garrett against the possibility of future settlement. You can't have this baby in a boarding house room, the doctor said when he examined her. You need to be in a hospital, or at least somewhere with proper facilities. Can't afford it. You're claiming one of the largest fortunes in the territory. Surely you can afford a hospital bed. I'm claiming it. Don't have it yet. Might never have it. The doctor sighed, but made arrangements anyway. When the time comes, send for me. I'll make sure you're taken care of one way or another. January 15th drew closer. The hearing date felt both impossibly far away and terrifyingly imminent. Garrett spent long hours preparing, rehearsing arguments, anticipating Catherine's challenges. Alara watched him work and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and guilt. He'd committed everything to this case, his time, his reputation, his resources, and if they lost, he'd lose it all. Why are you doing this? She asked him one evening when he'd stopped by to review testimony one more time. Really, you could have walked away from this disaster a dozen times. Why didn't you? Garrett was quiet for a moment, staring at the papers spread across Mrs. Chen's dining table. Then he looked up. My mother was a widow. My father died when I was 8, left her with 3 children and nothing else. She worked herself to death trying to keep us fed and clothed. Died when I was 16, worn out and used up by a system that didn't care if she lived or died. He tapped the will. This isn't about the money. It's about whether the system works for people like you and my mother, or only for people like Catherine Hale. I became a lawyer to find out. This case is the test. And if we lose, then I'll know the answer, and I'll spend the rest of my career trying to change it. He smiled slightly. But we're not going to lose. You sound certain. I am. Because Catherine's made a critical mistake. She thinks she's fighting a con artist or a gold digger, someone she can intimidate or discredit. She doesn't understand that she's fighting something more dangerous. What's that? Someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Garrett gathered his papers. Get some rest, Mrs. Quinn. In 2 weeks, we go to war. The night before the hearing, Alara couldn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair Mrs. Chen had moved into her room, watching snow fall past the window, and thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. Thomas dying in the spring mud, the long, desperate summer trying to save a failing ranch, Victor appearing at her door like something from a dark fairy tale, the choice she'd made to save him, to witness that will, to fight for what he'd given her. She thought about Catherine, probably sleeping soundly in her expensive hotel, confident that money and power would prevail the way they always had. and she thought about the baby, shifting and settling inside her, preparing for its own fight to be born. Tomorrow, in a courtroom full of strangers, she'd stand before a judge and claim the impossible. She'd face Catherine Hale and all the wealth and influence the woman could bring to bear. She'd tell her story and hope, desperately, fervently hope, that truth and law were stronger than money and corruption. "We're ready," she whispered to the baby, to the night, to whatever forces govern such moments. "Whatever happens, we're ready." The snow kept falling, covering Cheyenne in white silence, and Alara Quinn waited for morning. Morning arrived with brutal clarity. Alara woke at 5, though she'd barely slept, her body too tense and the baby too active to allow real rest. She washed with cold water from the basin, dressed in the only good dress she owned, dark blue wool, carefully mended at the seams, and braided her hair with fingers that trembled slightly despite her efforts at calm. Mrs. Chen met her in the kitchen with hot coffee and toast. Neither spoke much. Words felt inadequate for what lay ahead. Garrett arrived at 7:30, carrying a leather case stuffed with documents and wearing a suit that looked like he'd slept in it. Probably had, Alara thought. He'd been preparing until midnight at least. "Ready?" he asked. Alara touched her belly, felt the baby shift in response. "As I'll ever be." The courthouse steps were already crowded when they arrived. Word had spread, of course it had, and people had come to watch the spectacle. A pregnant widow claiming the Hale fortune. It was better than theater, more scandalous than the dime novels sold at the general store. Alara kept her eyes forward, let Garrett and Jack Cordell create a path through the onlookers, and tried to ignore the whispers that followed her like ghosts. Inside, the courtroom was everything she'd feared. High ceilings that made voices echo, dark wood paneling that absorbed light, rows of benches already filling with spectators. And at the front, behind an elevated desk that seemed designed to intimidate, Judge Harrison presided like something carved from stone. Catherine Hale sat at the opposing table with 3 lawyers, all of them in expensive suits that probably cost more than Alara's cabin had been worth. Catherine herself was dressed in black silk, her hair perfectly arranged, her posture radiating confidence. She looked at Alara once when they entered, her expression a study in cold contempt, then turned away as if dismissing something beneath notice. Garrett leaned close. "Don't let her get to you. That's what she wants. She wants you rattled, scared, ready to fold." "I'm terrified," Alara admitted quietly. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. Just channel it into focus. Remember what we're here to do. Present the facts, honor the will, claim what's legally yours." The Judge Harrison called the court to order at precisely 9 o'clock. His voice carried authority without volume, and the room fell silent immediately. "We are here to address the matter of the estate of Victor James Hale, deceased. Mrs. Alara Quinn has filed a will naming her as sole beneficiary. Mrs. Catherine Hale, the deceased sister, is contesting this will. Both parties will have the opportunity to present evidence and testimony. This is a probate hearing, not a trial, and I will make my determination based on the evidence presented and the law as written." He looked at both tables. "Mr. Garrett, you may proceed." Garrett stood, and Alara was struck by how young he suddenly looked. Not inexperienced, his movements were confident, practiced, but young. David facing Goliath with nothing but a sling and the certainty of his cause. "Your Honor, the facts of this case are straightforward. On November 17th of last year, Victor Hale appeared at Mrs. Quinn's property, severely injured from a gunshot wound. Mrs. Quinn, acting on basic human compassion, brought him inside and attempted to treat his injuries. Mr. Hale, knowing he was dying, composed a last will and testament, leaving his entire estate to Mrs. Quinn. He signed this document in her presence, she witnessed it, and he died approximately 6 hours later. Garrett placed the will on the evidence table. This document is legal, properly witnessed, and represents Mr. Hale's final wishes. The only question before this court is whether we will honor those wishes or allow them to be overturned by someone who stands to profit from their dismissal." Catherine's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Blackwood, who radiated Ivy League education and old money, stood immediately. "Your Honor, with respect to my colleague, the facts are far from straightforward. What we have here is a woman of dubious character who claims that a wealthy man, delirious with fever and trauma, signed over his entire fortune to her after knowing her for less than a day. This is not a legitimate will. This is opportunism at its most predatory. Save your arguments for when you present your case, Mr. Blackwood, Judge Harrison said mildly. Mr. Garrett, call your first witness. The next 3 hours were a masterclass in legal warfare. Garrett called Dr. Whitmore first, who testified about the condition of Victor's body when recovered, the gunshot wound, the timeline of death, the physical evidence that corroborated Alara's story. Blackwood tried to shake him on cross-examination, but the doctor was unflappable. Facts were facts, and the body didn't lie. Jonas Frost came next, testifying about transporting Alara to Cheyenne in her condition when he'd picked her up, exhausted, desperate, but coherent and consistent in her story. Then Daniel Frost, who described Alara's arrival in Broken Creek and his reasons for helping her. Simple human decency, he said. She'd been alone and pregnant and trying to reach Cheyenne for urgent business. What kind of man would he be if he'd turned her away? Blackwood tried to suggest they'd been bribed or coerced, but neither man budged. Their testimony was too straightforward, too lacking in obvious motive to be easily dismissed. Then Garrett called the ranch hands, the men who'd worked for Victor and been willing to speak despite Catherine's influence. They painted a picture of Victor as careful, methodical, someone who didn't make impulsive decisions. And they painted Catherine as ruthless, someone who'd been systematically taking control even while her brother was alive. Mr. Hale didn't trust her, one foreman said bluntly. Told me so himself about 6 months before he disappeared. Said she cared more about money than people, and if anything happened to him, she'd destroy everything he'd tried to build. Objection, Blackwood said sharply. Hearsay. Goes to state of mind, Garrett countered. The witness is testifying to what Mr. Hale told him directly, which is relevant to understanding why Mr. Hale might have chosen to bypass his sister in his will. Judge Harrison considered. I'll allow it. Continue. The testimony accumulated like weight on a scale, gradually tipping in Alara's favor. But Catherine's team wasn't finished. When it was Blackwood's turn to present, he came out swinging. His first witness was a handwriting expert who claimed Victor's signature on the will showed signs of distress and possible coercion. The letters were shaky, the pressure inconsistent. It could indicate someone guiding his hand or forcing him to sign against his will. Garrett demolished this on cross-examination by pointing out that Victor had been dying of a gunshot wound. Of course, his handwriting was shaky. The expert admitted, grudgingly, that the signature could also simply be the work of a man in extreme pain trying to complete an urgent task. Then Blackwood called a doctor who testified about the effects of fever and blood loss on mental capacity. In Victor's condition, he argued, the man would have been barely conscious, certainly not capable of making rational decisions about a $400,000 estate. But the will was written clearly, Garrett pointed out. The language is specific, the intent is obvious. If Mr. Hale was as impaired as you suggest, how do you explain the coherence of the document? The doctor hedged, admitted it was possible for someone in that condition to have moments of clarity, especially if they'd been lucid when they started writing. Then Catherine herself took the stand. She was magnificent, Alara had to admit, poised, articulate, playing the role of grieving sister with just enough restraint to seem genuine. She spoke about Victor's struggles in recent years, his erratic behavior, his paranoia about business partners. She painted him as a man who'd been declining mentally for months, prone to wild accusations and poor judgment. He was my brother, and I loved him, Catherine said, her voice breaking perfectly on cue. But he wasn't well. He hadn't been well for a long time, and the idea that he would leave everything to a complete stranger, bypassing his own family, shows exactly how impaired he'd become. Garrett's cross-examination was surgical. Mrs. Hale, you testified that your brother was paranoid about business partners. Were there specific partners he was concerned about? Several. He'd made accusations that weren't based in reality. What kind of accusations? Catherine hesitated. He claimed people were stealing from him, manipulating contracts, trying to take control of his properties. And were they? Of course not. Garrett pulled out a document. This is a financial audit of the Hale Ranch properties, commissioned by your brother 6 months before his death. According to this audit, there were significant discrepancies in the accounts, specifically funds being redirected from operational accounts into private holdings. Private holdings that belong to you, Mrs. Hale. Catherine's composure cracked slightly. Those were legitimate business expenses. $60,000 in business expenses over a 9-month period with no documentation? I don't have to justify my business decisions to you. No, but you do have to justify them to this court when you're claiming your brother was paranoid without cause. Garrett let that sink in. The truth is, Mr. Hale wasn't paranoid. He was correct. You were taking control of his assets while he was alive, and when he realized it, he took steps to prevent you from inheriting everything. Objection! Blackwood was on his feet. Counsel is testifying, not questioning. Sustained. Mr. Garrett, ask questions or sit down. Apologies, Your Honor. Garrett turned back to Catherine. Mrs. Hale, did you or did you not have business associates follow Mrs. Quinn, attempt to bribe her, and file false criminal charges against her when she refused your buyout offer? I took appropriate legal action to protect my family's interests. That's not what I asked. Did you file criminal charges knowing they were baseless, simply to intimidate Mrs. Quinn? Catherine's eyes were cold as winter ice. I filed charges because I believed a crime had been committed. And when those charges were dismissed with prejudice by Judge Morrison, who called them harassment and abuse of process, did that change your belief? Judge Morrison is entitled to his opinion. It's not an opinion, Mrs. Hale. It's a legal finding. Garrett walked back to his table. No further questions. The damage was done. Catherine left the stand looking less composed than when she'd arrived, and the spectators had seen behind the mask of grieving sister to something harder and more calculating beneath. Finally, Garrett called Alara. The walk to the witness stand felt impossibly long. Every eye in the courtroom was on her, judging, calculating, making decisions about her character and her story. She placed her hand on the Bible, though the irony of swearing to truth on a book she barely knew wasn't lost on her, and promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Garrett's questions were gentle, designed to let her tell her story in her own words. She described the night Victor arrived, her decision to help despite the risk, his condition, his lucidity, despite the pain. She explained how he'd insisted on writing the will, how he'd been clear about his reasons, wanting to protect his legacy from someone he didn't trust, choosing her precisely because she had no agenda, no prior relationship to manipulate. I didn't want his money, Alara said, looking directly at Judge Harrison. I still don't, not really, but I'm not going to apologize for accepting it. Victor Hale made a choice, in full possession of his faculties, about what to do with his property. I witnessed that choice, and now I'm asking this court to honor it. Then came Blackwood's cross-examination, and Alara understood why Catherine had paid him so much. He was brutal, methodical, designed to strip away sympathy and reveal calculation beneath. Mrs. Quinn, you were in significant debt when Mr. Hale arrived at your property. Is that correct? Yes. How much debt? $240. And you were about to lose your land? Yes. So you were desperate. I was in difficult circumstances, yes. Desperate enough to take advantage of a dying man? I didn't take advantage. I helped him. You helped him by convincing him to sign over $400,000? I didn't convince him of anything. It was his idea. His idea. A man you'd known for less than 6 hours, dying of a gunshot wound, delirious with fever, and you expect this court to believe he spontaneously decided to make you one of the wealthiest women in the territory? I expect this court to look at the evidence. The will is legal. The signature is real. The circumstances are exactly as I described them. Blackwood shifted tactics. You've been married before, Mrs. Quinn. Yes. Your husband died in March of last year? Yes. How did he die? Alara felt the trap closing but couldn't see a way around it. He was kicked by a horse, died from internal injuries. I see. And were there any witnesses to this accident? The ranch hands who worked for us, but they'd left by the time I buried him. How convenient. So we only have your word for how your husband actually died. Rage flared hot in Alara's chest. Are you suggesting I killed my husband? I'm suggesting that you have a pattern of being present when men die under convenient circumstances, and that perhaps this court should examine that pattern more closely. Objection! Garrett was on his feet, his voice sharp with anger. This is outrageous. Counsel is making wild accusations with absolutely no evidence. Your Honor, I'm establishing a pattern of behavior, Blackwood said smoothly. You're slandering my client, Garrett shot back. There's not a shred of evidence that Mrs. Quinn had anything to do with her husband's death, and bringing it up is nothing more than a desperate attempt to prejudice the court. Judge Harrison held up a hand. Enough! Mr. Blackwood, unless you have actual evidence of wrongdoing, you will refrain from making inflammatory suggestions. This is a probate hearing, not a murder investigation. Stick to the matter at hand. Blackwood nodded, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. Alara could see it in the faces of the spectators, hear it in the whispers that rippled through the courtroom. She left the stand feeling like she'd been flayed open, every vulnerability exposed and examined. Garrett squeezed her shoulder as she sat down, a gesture of solidarity, but it didn't help much. The trial, the hearing, she corrected herself, continued with closing arguments, but Alara barely heard them. She was too exhausted, too wrung out from the emotional gauntlet she'd just survived. Finally, Judge Harrison called a recess. I'll review the evidence and testimony and render my decision tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Court is adjourned. The wait was agony. Alara returned to the boarding house and couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely sit still. The baby was restless too, kicking and shifting constantly, as if it could sense her distress. Mrs. Chen tried to distract her with conversation, with food, with anything, but nothing worked. The uncertainty was too vast, too consuming. Garrett stopped by in the evening, looking as exhausted as Alara felt. I think it went well, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Harrison's a fair judge. He'll base his decision on the evidence, not on Catherine's money or influence. But what if the evidence isn't enough? What if he decides Victor wasn't competent or that I manipulated him somehow? Then we appeal, and we keep fighting until someone listens. I don't have the strength for that. Garrett looked at her seriously. Yes, you do. I've watched you face down Catherine Hale, survive arrest, endure character assassination, and stand up in that courtroom today and tell your truth without flinching. You have more strength than anyone I've ever met. Don't give up now. Morning came again, inevitable as death. Alara dressed, ate nothing, and made her way back to the courthouse with Garrett at her side. The crowd was even larger today. People had come from surrounding towns to hear the verdict. Alara pushed through them, kept her eyes forward, and tried to breathe. Judge Harrison entered at 9 o'clock exactly. The courtroom fell silent so completely that Alara could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The judge settled into his chair, arranged papers on his desk, and looked out at the assembled crowd. I have reviewed all evidence and testimony presented in the matter of the estate of Victor James Hale. This has been a complex case involving questions of mental capacity, documentary validity, and the intentions of a deceased man who can no longer speak for himself. I have weighed these questions carefully against the law and the evidence. He paused, and Alara felt time stretch impossibly thin. The central question before this court is whether the will presented by Mrs. Quinn is valid. To answer that, I must determine three things. First, whether the document itself meets legal requirements for a will. Second, whether Mr. Hale had the mental capacity to execute such a document. And third, whether there was any undue influence or coercion in its creation. Judge Harrison picked up the will, held it where everyone could see. On the first question, the document is clear. It meets all legal requirements. It states the testator's name, explicitly revokes all previous wills, names a beneficiary, and is signed and dated by the testator in the presence of a witness. Technically, it is a valid will. Alara felt a flicker of hope. On the second question, mental capacity, the evidence is more complex. Mr. Hale was undoubtedly suffering from severe physical trauma when he wrote this document. However, multiple witnesses have testified to his mental clarity and careful decision-making throughout his life. The will itself is coherent and specific, showing clear intent, and most importantly, no evidence has been presented that Mr. Hale was mentally incapacitated at the time of signing, only that he was in physical distress. Pain and impending death do not automatically invalidate mental capacity. Catherine's face had gone pale. Blackwood was leaning forward, tense. On the third question, undue influence, I find no credible evidence. Mrs. Quinn was not in a position of power over Mr. Hale. She did not seek him out or encourage this bequest. By all accounts, she was merely a woman who showed basic human kindness to a stranger in need. That Mr. Hale chose to repay this kindness by naming her his heir may seem unusual, but it is not illegal, nor does it suggest improper influence. Judge Harrison set down the will and looked directly at Alara. I am also mindful of the pattern of behavior exhibited by the contestant, Mrs. Catherine Hale. The evidence shows repeated attempts to intimidate Mrs. Quinn, including offering bribes, filing baseless criminal charges, and engaging in character assassination. This behavior suggests not a genuine concern about the validity of the will, but rather an attempt to bully Mrs. Quinn into surrendering a legitimate claim. Such behavior does not reflect well on the contestant's arguments. Catherine was gripping the table edge now, her knuckles white. Therefore, it is the finding of this court that the last will and testament of Victor James Hale, dated November 17, 1887, is valid and legally binding. The estate of Victor James Hale shall pass to Mrs. Alara Quinn as specified in said will. Mrs. Catherine Hale's contest is denied. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. For a moment, Alara couldn't process what she'd heard. The words made sense individually, but strung together, they seemed impossible. She'd won. The court had ruled in her favor. The inheritance was hers. The courtroom erupted in noise, gasps, conversations, people talking over each other. Catherine was on her feet, Blackwood speaking urgently in her ear, but whatever he was saying couldn't change the reality. The decision was final. Garrett was grinning, actually grinning, something Alara had never seen him do. We won. Do you understand? We won.
I heard, Alara said, and suddenly she was crying, tears streaming down her face despite her best efforts to hold them back. Relief, exhaustion, disbelief, all of it crashed over her at once. Blackwood was already talking about appeals, about filing motions, but Judge Harrison cut him off. You may file whatever you wish, Mr. Blackwood, but be aware that frivolous appeals will be viewed dimly by the territorial court. This matter has been decided based on clear evidence and sound legal reasoning. I suggest your client accept the ruling and move on. Catherine stood, and for a moment her eyes met Alara's across the courtroom. The hatred there was pure and absolute, undiluted by any pretense of civility. Then she turned and walked out, her lawyers trailing behind her like leaves in her wake. The crowd pressed in, asking questions, offering congratulations or expressions of disbelief. Garrett and Jack Cordell created a protective barrier, steering Alara toward the exit and out into the cold January morning. What happens now? Alara asked when they'd reached the relative safety of the street. Now we execute the will formally. Transfer of titles, accessing accounts, taking possession of the properties. It'll take a few weeks to complete all the paperwork, but legally, you own everything as of this moment. Garrett paused. You're going to need to make a lot of decisions very quickly. Hire a business manager, probably. Accountants. People to help you navigate what you've just inherited. The reality of it was starting to sink in. Not just the money, though that was staggering, but the responsibility. 53,000 acres of land, ranches full of people who depended on that land for their livelihoods. Business interests she didn't understand. A life completely different from anything she'd ever known. I don't know how to do any of this, she said quietly. You'll learn. You're good at surviving impossible situations. This is just a different kind of impossible. Garrett smiled. Besides, you won't be alone. I'll help with the legal side. Mrs. Chen knows half the business people in Cheyenne and can make introductions. And Victor's ranch hands, the ones who testified, they'll help you understand the properties. Over the next 3 weeks, Alara's life transformed so completely it felt like someone else's existence she'd accidentally stepped into. She met with accountants who showed her ledgers full of numbers too large to comprehend. She visited the main ranch house, a sprawling structure that could have held her old cabin 20 times over, and met the people who'd worked for Victor. Some were suspicious, others cautiously hopeful. All of them were watching to see what kind of person she'd be. She made her first major decision 2 days after the court ruling. The ranch hands who'd testified on her behalf, risking Catherine's wrath to tell the truth, each received bonuses of $500 and guarantees of continued employment. It depleted a tiny fraction of the estate's liquid assets and bought her more loyalty than any amount of intimidation ever could. Her second decision came a week later. She hired Thomas Garrett as the estate's permanent legal counsel at a salary that made him nearly choke on his coffee. You don't have to, he started, but she cut him off. You believed me when no one else would. You fought for me when you had every reason to walk away. This is what I can give you in return. Take it.
He took it. Catherine made one final attempt to destroy her. A hired man showed up at the ranch house one night, armed and clearly intending violence. But Jack Cordell, now head of estate security, was ready. The man was arrested, questioned, and ultimately testified that Catherine had paid him $5,000 to handle the problem of Alara Quinn. The territorial marshal issued a warrant, and Catherine fled to San Francisco before it could be served. She'd return eventually, Alara knew. Women like Catherine always did. But for now, she was gone. The baby came on a cold February morning, 3 weeks early, but healthy and screaming with indignation at the world it had been thrust into. Alara labored for 14 hours in the ranch house bedroom, attended by the best doctor money could hire and supported by Mrs. Chen, who'd moved to the ranch to help with the transition. When it was finally over, when they placed the baby in her arms, a girl, perfect and furious, Alara cried for the third time since this all began. "What will you name her?" Mrs. Chen asked. Alara looked down at her daughter, at the tiny fists waving in protest, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The choice to save a dying stranger, the gamble that had paid off against all odds, the fight that had redefined her entire existence. "Victoria," she said, after her father's friend, "the man who gave us this chance." Spring came to Wyoming with its usual dramatic flair, snow melting into floods, the plains turning green overnight, new calves stumbling on uncertain legs while their mothers grazed the emerging grass. Alara stood on the porch of the ranch house, Victoria sleeping in a cradle beside her, and looked out over land that stretched to the horizon. It was hers. All of it. The impossible had become real. The ranch hands were moving cattle to summer pasture. In the distance, she could see the line camps Victor had mentioned, small structures that dotted the vast property. Beyond those, the mountains rose like promises of things yet to come. It was beautiful and overwhelming and terrifying all at once. "You thinking about your old cabin?" Mrs. Chen asked, joining her on the porch with 2 cups of tea. "Sometimes. Seems like another lifetime now." It was. "You're a different person than you were 6 months ago." "Am I?" Alara accepted the tea. "I don't feel different, just more. More everything. More money, more responsibility, more people depending on you." Mrs. Chen sipped her tea. "The question is, what are you going to do with it all?" Alara had been thinking about that. The estate needed management, certainly. The ranches needed to be run properly, the business interests maintained. But there was something else. Something Victor had said that last night that had stayed with her. He'd wanted to protect people. The ranchers who depended on the land, the workers who kept the properties running. He'd seen what Catherine would do: consolidate power, maximize profit, care nothing for the human cost, and he'd tried to prevent it. "I want to do it differently," Alara said slowly. "The ranch hands who work here, I want to offer them shares in the operation. Not huge percentages, but enough that they have a stake in the success. Enough that this becomes their land too, not just mine." Mrs. Chen raised her eyebrows. "That's radical. Most landowners would never even consider it. Most landowners didn't get their land by dragging a corpse across Wyoming in winter. I'm not most landowners." Alara smiled. "Besides, Victor trusted me to do something different with his legacy. This is what that looks like." Over the next year, Alara Quinn became something the territory had never quite seen before. She ran the Hale properties with a combination of practical efficiency and unexpected compassion, making decisions that prioritized sustainability over maximum profit. She paid fair wages, invested in infrastructure that benefited the community, and created a profit-sharing system that made her ranch hands the envy of workers throughout the territory. She also never forgot where she'd come from. Every month, she set aside money to help widows in circumstances similar to what hers had been. Women facing debt, poverty, impossible choices. Some people called it charity. Alara called it insurance against the kind of desperation that had nearly destroyed her. Thomas Garrett became not just her lawyer, but her friend, eventually her closest advisor. Together, they navigated the complex world of frontier business, learning as they went, making mistakes, but never backing down from challenges. Catherine never returned to Wyoming. Alara heard occasional reports. She was in San Francisco, then New York, then London. Building a new life, accumulating new wealth, probably plotting new schemes. Alara didn't worry about it much. Let Catherine have her empire elsewhere. Wyoming was Alara's now. Victoria grew from a screaming infant into a determined toddler who treated the vast ranch as her personal kingdom. She'd be raised with advantages Alara had never known: education, opportunity, choices. But she'd also be raised with the story of how they'd gotten here. The choice in the snow, the fight that had followed, the truth that power meant nothing without the courage to use it justly. On the first anniversary of Victor's death, Alara rode out to the small cemetery in Broken Creek, where he'd been buried. She brought flowers, wildflowers from the prairie, the kind that grew stubborn and beautiful in impossible conditions, and stood beside the grave for a long time. "I kept my promise," she told him, though he was long past hearing. "I fought for what you gave me, and I won. Your legacy didn't go to Catherine. It went to someone who's trying to use it the way you wanted, to protect people, not exploit them." The wind blew across the plains, carrying the scent of sage and grass and distant rain. Alara closed her eyes and felt it wash over her. The same wind that had howled the night Victor arrived, the same wind that had tried to freeze her during that desperate journey to Cheyenne, the same wind that had witnessed every impossible choice and unlikely victory. She was still that woman who'd stood at the edge of her failing property, counting coins and watching horizons. But she was also something more now, something forged in desperation and tempered by trial. A widow who'd refused to disappear. A mother building a future from the ashes of the past. A woman who'd gambled everything on one moment of compassion and won an empire. Not because she'd been strong, though she had been. Not because she'd been clever, though that had helped. But because when it mattered most, when a dying man had appeared at her door and offered her an impossible choice, she'd chosen to be human instead of safe. And somehow, against all logic and probability, that choice had been enough. Alara Quinn returned to her horse, mounted carefully, and rode back toward the ranch house, visible in the distance. Victoria would be waking from her nap soon, and there was work to be done. There was always work to be done. But it was her work now, on her land, building her future. The frontier was brutal and beautiful and unforgiving. It broke most people who challenged it. But Alara had learned something important during those impossible months between Victor's arrival and this moment of reflection. The frontier could be survived. Not by being harder than it was, that was impossible, but by being stubborn enough to keep standing when everything said you should fall. By making the right choice even when it seemed wrong. By trusting that justice and truth might occasionally, miraculously, overcome money and power. The ranch house drew closer, and Alara could see Mrs. Chen on the porch, Victoria in her arms, both of them watching her approach. Family, she thought. Not the one she'd been born to or the one she'd married into, but the one she'd built from strangers and circumstance and shared struggle. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. And as the Wyoming sun climbed higher in the endless blue sky, Alara Quinn rode toward home, leaving behind the woman she'd been and embracing fully the woman she'd become. A woman who'd reshaped her own destiny, not through privilege or luck, but through one simple, impossible, world-changing choice made on a frozen November night when giving up would have been so much easier than fighting. She'd chosen to fight, and she'd won. The story could have ended there, with triumph and transformation complete. But Alara knew better. Stories didn't really end. They just changed shape, became the foundation for new stories, new choices, new impossibilities to overcome. Victoria would have her own battles someday. The land would present new challenges. Catherine might return. Life would continue being exactly what it had always been, difficult, unpredictable, occasionally brutal. But Alara was ready for it. Whatever came next, she'd face it the same way she'd faced everything else. With stubbornness, with courage, and with the bone-deep certainty that she'd survived worse and would survive this too. The frontier had tried to break her. Instead, she'd broken it to her will, and in doing so, she'd proven something important, not just to herself, but to every woman watching, every person struggling, every soul who'd been told they were too weak or too poor or too powerless to matter. Sometimes, when everything was against you and the odds were impossible, and the smart choice was to give up, the right choice was to fight anyway. Not because you'd win, you probably wouldn't, but because the act of fighting, the refusal to disappear quietly, was itself a kind of victory. Alara Quinn had learned that lesson in blood and snow and courtroom battles. Now she'd spend the rest of her life teaching it to anyone who'd listen. The ranch house door opened. Mrs. Chen waved. Victoria's laugh carried across the distance, high and bright, and full of the kind of joy that came from being loved and safe and promised a future. Elara smiled, touched her heels to her horse's flanks, and rode home to the life she'd earned, the family she'd chosen, and the empire she'd won by refusing to be anything less than impossible.